Good morning, evening, afternoon. When you think of sports, where does your mind go? Does it go football, basketball, baseball, tennis, Olympics? It can go to a lot of places. But when you got an up and coming monster making his name noticed, you have to take notice. And that's what the UFC is doing. The UFC is basically mixed martial arts at the peak level of where you want to be. But in order to understand the UFC, we got to explore the history of how it all started, the divisions in the UFC, and some of the current former champions that really shaped what the sport is, and then how frequent the events are, because that's a big part of what makes the UFC so great compared to a lot of other sports. But before we dive into that, let's think about what is the UFC. We got to start somewhere, right? Where did it come from? How did it make it this far? So the UFC was founded in 1993 as a professional mixed martial arts organization, basing its background on mostly a Greek style of fighting, dating back to 840 BC, according to the UFC website. It's the largest pay-per-view provider in the world. So those HBO channels you got to buy for $50 to watch for 3 hours, they lead every sport in that category. The UFC is broadcasted to over 165 countries, and it has the highest concentrations of millennials in any sport that view this sport. In 2001, Dana White, Lorenzo Fertitta, and Frank Fertitta bought the UFC from its previous owners at Zuffa. They changed the name to UFC, and in 1997, they began establishing weight classes and divisions because before then, no matter how big or small you were, you could fight anybody. A mouse could fight a dinosaur. It was really that serious. And then they introduced the lightweight and the heavyweight division in 1997. And they then made complete division separation by 2003. So now that we got into that topic briefly about division separation, hint, hint, we're moving on. Let's jump into what the separation of divisions and the champions that molded this division actually mean for the landscape of the UFC. The separation of the divisions is specifically that. You have 3 to 4 women's divisions. You have flyweight, bantamweight, strawweight, and then and featherweight. And in the men's division, you have featherweight, bantamweight, strawweight, flyweight, welterweight, lightweight, light heavyweight, middleweight, and heavyweight. These divisions are separated by weight. So, for example, light heavyweight is 205 pounds, is the maximum you can be. Heavyweight, the max is 265 pounds. Middleweight is 185, so on and so forth. And each division in the UFC is split male and female. So males never fight females, females never fight males, vice versa. The active roster, according to UFC, as of January 2025, has 578 active fighters on the roster. And a few notable names that have made UFC as big as it was. You have John Jones, who is the youngest UFC champion ever. He was the light heavyweight champion for a long time. Fell back, came back to the sport, moved up to heavyweight, dominates the sport, arguably the greatest of all time to ever do it. Max Holloway, the most insane striker in UFC history. I don't think there's a boxer that can compete with Max Holloway. He's light on his feet, really fast hands. And then someone that all of us, if not all of us, most of us have heard of from either his antics or him fighting, Conor McGregor, really put the spotlight on the UFC right before COVID started happening, which brought a lot of viewership as people had to stay home. And the reason for the separation of the weight classes is for the competitive advantage and to specialize. Like if you specialize at a certain weight, or you could move up and your body was good at losing and gaining weight, you could fight at different weight classes and really make a name for yourself. Or as you got older, when cutting weight was harder, you'll go up a division so you don't have to cut weight too often on your body. But the divisions and the champions wouldn't make sense unless you got to witness the greatness of watching these fights and watching these gladiators get into the ring and make the magic happen. that leads me to my last topic, the frequency of the matchmaking. The frequency the UFC events holds is remarkable. Their consistency is key. They have a fight every Saturday. Not a fight, but there's about 15 fights. One big card is what they call it, the event. It's about 7 hours long. It's about 15 fights. Every weekend you get to, so 30 fighters are staying active every single weekend. Matchmaking is skill-based, so you're only fighting fighters around your value or higher or a little bit lower, depending on the stipulations. And then the pay-per-view events, they're the leading pay-per-view provider in the world. They hold one a month, sometimes two, but it's usually one per month. And they're usually the cream of the crop fighters. The best fighters in the world on the UFC rosters come fight on the pay-per-view and make the most of their money on pay-per-view. American football, as compared, you have games on Sundays. But you only have 5 months of football and it's gone. UFC, you have UFC for 50 weeks out of the year. So only 2 weeks. 2 weeks of downtime. That's usually right at the end of the year. Let people celebrate Christmas and New Year's with their family. Boxing's best events, you will have 3 a year. So that's already a comparative advantage for the UFC. And then basketball, you have 82 games. That's a lot. But it's all compressed into a 5-month time, which makes the sport hard to follow because it's seasonal. But now that we covered all the topics, we'll undergo a summary of the events and get you guys on your way. With the UFC moving at a tremendous rate and providing one of the most active sports that we know, it's become a leading pioneer in the mixed martial arts scene while continuously getting better. The separation of the divisions, its history, and its champions that bestowed the belt now, and future champs that can come shape the UFC, and the past champs that kind of made the UFC what it is. But now that you hear, next time you hear that there's a good UFC event on and you like comeback sports, please give it a shot. It might be worth every second. Thank you. My name is Diogene Downs.